Everybody, welcome. This is the webinar, What Really Matters in Design Systems. Today, I'm really excited to moderate a panel around how design systems are changing, how our landscape is evolving in the way that we create digital products. And with me, I have three other great participants. First, I'm Chris Strahl. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Knapsack. I'm also the host of the Design Systems podcast. And my job here is to basically hear from all these other wonderful people, which I'll go ahead and allow themselves to do an introduction. First, from left to right is Melissa.
Hi, everybody. Melissa Butler here, and I lead the digital channels web team in GSK. My team is responsible for our design system that is powering roughly 75 websites for our marketing teams in the US. Also, while I'm here, the lawyers require that I say that my comments today are reflective of my industry experience, which includes my current employer. They may or may not reflect GSK's positions and are not an endorsement of any vendor.
Make sure you write that down. Get a quiz
Yep.
later. Catherine?
I'm Catherine Gonzalez. I was the first designer and front engineer at a little company called DoorDash. And I used to run the design infrastructure org, which included design systems, accessibility, prototyping, and design engineering.
And then Sriram?
Hey, this is Sriram. I support design systems at Meta. I've been in this space at Meta for about 10 years now.
Awesome. Well, really excited to get talking with you all. I'm going to stop the screen share after I go through a quick agenda. We're going to talk about four things and then make sure we leave some ample time for Q&A at the end. First, we're going to kick it off talking about a systems-based approach to the way we think about design instead of the typical design to engineering flow. We're going to talk a lot about specifications and how they represent an interesting idea of a shared source of truth. We're going to talk about how those specifications ultimately lead to better collaboration for design and engineering teams. And then we're going to look at how this is changing the digital production process to be more democratized and more accessible to everybody inside of the organization. And then again, like I said, lots of time for Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share and kick us off. So part of the genesis of this panel was this idea that we're starting to break the foundational way that we've thought about building digital products for 25, 30 years at this point. And we've always sort of had this notion that I think comes from print design, that comes from a lot of the historical ideas of what design in corporate environments look like, where you have this idea of we make this thing that represents design intent. And for most of us, that's a Figma file. And that Figma file is where we've captured a lot of design decisions, where we've created a visual indication of what is in our brain to put it in digital paper. And then we have this idea of handoff, where that then goes to the people that build it, which are largely engineers. And then those engineers take that design abstraction, that intent, and they turn it into something that can actually then be consumed by users in predominantly a web browser, but there's lots of other different mediums as well. In that flow, one of the big challenges that we face is that engineers are still making a tremendous number of design decisions. And that's kind of always been the case, is there's lots of things that don't exist in our abstractions, in our intent, that ultimately still show up in user reality. And that one-way flow of information also has this tendency to break down when you try to go back upstream. So some design decision that happened over in engineering, getting that back into Figma is a lot harder because our processes are usually designed around this idea of designers are first, they hand something to engineers, and then the engineers go and build that thing, and then that shows up in front of users. How is that changing because of design systems?
I think one of the things that I found at DoorDash that was really important is that having the same material, the same language of what you're using between design and engineering is the way that you have better collaboration, better quality at the end of the day, because there's less loss of information between both sides. And you're actually working on the reality of what the end user is going to actually be working with. And I think having design systems be that like sort of central sort of tool and place where those different sides, not just design and engineering, but also product and even other sort of functions can kind of work on the same tool in a way that fits within their different sort of spaces and their different sort of process and workflows. That's kind of the real key of what design systems I think has brought over like the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's funny, right? Because you brought up naming, and like one of the traditional things, like the hard problems in the world are things like time and calendar implementations, and then like how you name things. And so the harmonization of naming, I think, is a really powerful part. In particular, Catherine, like you have this great background that crosses both design and engineering. And that's how you think about the connection in the systems, is by basically saying, let's rally around the things that are common to both parts of the discipline.
Yeah, because I think if you have a space where there's different decisions, different sort of language being used, you have a lack of sort of understanding of what is happening on each side, and you end up sort of working on functionally different things, and being able to like bring those things together, I think helps the team both have like the right level of ownership over like the shared outcome of what it is that ultimately these design systems are for, but then also too that like there is a shared understanding and empathy on both sides to actually work together to solve the problems versus working in one space and you're one small part of the problem.
Melissa, how does that feel when you think
Yeah.
about that relative to a big, multinational pharmaceutical company?
I totally agree with that, and I think from my perspective, the challenge has always been, before we started the design system journey, is that what's designed and approved in the by the brand or by regulatory ultimately isn't exactly what can be built, because what's in the design file, there has to be probably some provisions that engineering has to make, and that's where they make some of those design decisions. And at the end of the day, it may not exactly reflect what was being designed. Um, we want to definitely, get ahead of that and make sure that the designers who are working on a new website design are using the components that we know can be built or already pre-built, ideally, so that there's not a surprise at the engineering implementation of, oh, hey, I know this is what you thought it would look like and how it would behave, and that's what legal approved, but it actually isn't possible. So I love the fact of, the design systems will enable us to kind of obviate that situation from happening.
So you think about like fighting the battles, if you will, or the back and forth, really at that creation of that pattern or that component, and then you think about it as basically paying it forward to then the implementation of those patterns in a product.
Yeah, absolutely.
Suram, I intentionally left you to the end because I think you have a really kind of unique viewpoint on this, and you've been, in my opinion, kind of living in the future for a little while. And so, talk to me about how this works at Meta.
At Meta, we have this more as a collaborative process between designers and engineers. I think of design system as a repository of shared decisions, right? Obviously, it originates with some sort of brand thinking, and designers come up with how a system should look and behave. But oftentimes, in a metrics-driven company like Meta, we would want to test it with users, and we want those decisions to be, or the feedback loop to be going back to the system. So it is a collaborative process, which means we need a different medium outside of a design tool to have these design decisions documented. So we use a process where we have specifications for each of these components and patterns and whatnot, where designers, engineers, accessibility specialists, content designers all collaborate in defining what a spec for a particular component or pattern should look like.
Yeah, and what form does that take when you get everybody together and you say like, okay, I've got design that is caring about Figma. I've got, a native engineering group that is caring about, predominantly Android and iOS. and I've got a bunch of web folks that all care about like HTML and CSS at the end of the day. All those people have different users that they're trying to serve. And so what form does that specification take? Because lots of us, when we envision spec in our mind, I'm starting to feel old in this industry. And so I go back to this idea of like, what's the 40-page document that has like a bunch of pseudocode and a bunch of entity tables in it, and like, things that specify cardinality and little chicken feet graphs everywhere. And so like, what does that look like in your world when you create that spec?
For us, we iterated a bit to arrive at where we are today. We have a simple template where a designer or engineer can go in and fill out various parts of a component. For example, there will be a section about here's the size for a button. Here are the tokens that we need to use for different sizes of a button. Or there will be a section around accessibility to say how to convey certain accessibility features. And there will be a section about content design. So this is a text-based file with a bunch of fields that someone will have to answer. And this is a standard template so that it is scalable across any kind of components that we want to build. And because think of it as more like a Google Doc, while it's not a Google Doc. Designers, engineers, and anyone who has access to Google Doc can go and edit these specs.
So you think about this as this collaborative process where all these different stakeholders come in, they all contribute what they need from a spec. So like take our favorite punching bag component pattern, the button. Everybody defines what they need from a button. And then that's an agreed upon thing that exists inside of all parties. And then what happens? Because I think this is where the magic is. You don't actually think about this in terms of like this, it gets implemented in Figma and then it gets implemented in code. It's that everybody implements that spec, right?
That's right. So this is the source of truth for how the component development process works. Even if you think about Figma, we have a few different options when it comes to Figma. There is the components approach that Figma provides. There is also a concept of sticker sheet where we generate all different possibilities for a component that people can just copy paste, which means a design system designer specs out what a basic version of a component should look like. And then it goes into production design where all different variants of a component should come up. So this specification is the reference for anyone to build what I call as a port of a design system. So you can take the specification and build it for React Native, or you can take the specification and build it for Figma. Or we do have our own prototyping tools like Origami, where we would take this specification and build our Origami components.
So turn it over to Catherine and Melissa. What do you all think about that? Is that a brave new world, or is that something that you all are working towards?
I think for DoorDash, it was really important because we were such a multi-platform sort of product, similar to at Meta. Having that right level of abstraction that we are all sort of working at to be able to define like what it is that we need. I think for us, like, we had many different brands that we were managing, many different sort of technical platforms that we're building for, and many different kinds of audience types between, a consumer space, a more sort of merchant space, or even an internal tool space. And so being able to have the sort of specifications, sort of a similar concept to what Meta was doing, to have what the core of the design systems is, with all these different layers sort of specifying for this particular audience, or for this particular platform, or for this particular brand. How do we sort of adjust and modify what the design system representation is for those different spaces and combinations of spaces? I think that was something that we needed to be able to be successful at helping all of our designers and engineers across those spaces. So it definitely resonates with me.
Yeah, similarly, similar to Catherine, in GSK, we have many brands that are using our design system, as well as different audiences. And with each audience, there are different levels of legal and regulatory requirements. So the upfront specification is absolutely critical. We're working towards a more structured process there. I think what we have in place now definitely touches on some of the things that Meta is doing. I would add to that, we also, because our design system right now is solely focused on websites, so we include SEO requirements at the component spec level, and then obviously the regulatory requirements that I mentioned as well.
Yeah, and that's a big part about what you're really looking to gain from a design system is you'll have very complex regulatory frameworks being in the pharma life sciences area, and as a result, there is a lot of things that can't get lost in that transition from intent to reality. How does this help with that? How do you ensure that that work gets captured, and how do you ensure that that shows up in the final product, regardless of whose responsibility it is to actually create the product?
Yeah, so in my case, a close partnership with the digital governance group, which represents legal and regulatory. For those components um, that pull through the mandated requirements, working with my partners in legal and regulatory at the component level and saying this is what we're planning to do, and they'll ask various questions, or they might bring up a use case about a brand that I wasn't thinking about, and we might have to make adjustments to the component to account for a longer brand name or a longer, whatever disclaimer that has to be on there. So um, it does involve more than just product design and engineering. We have to make sure that we're including that input directly, and I think partnership with those roles is important.
It's true. I imagine that's really important for you as well. I mean, Meta is in probably every language that is on the internet, and in probably every country that in that case where you're thinking about how do you create the right flexibility in a spec, what inputs into that are outside of the core design and engineering side of things? Is it accessibility? Is it like internationalization? What other stakeholder groups participate in that process?
Yeah. So we definitely have designers and engineers coming up with the bare bones spec, right? So let's go back to the same punchback button. So we will define a button to have like, this is the maximum size a button can have. And then we wouldn't think about other languages, which is where a content designer would come in and specify how to treat longer words, or should it be two lines? Should we bump down the font size? If we are bumping down the font size, how low can we go, and whatnot? And then accessibility specialists would come in and add their specifications for how to deal with a particular component. Those are the major stakeholders when it comes to building a component, and this is all happening in one central location.
Gotcha. And that sounds like an iterative process where you have like you said, that minimum spec, the bare bones, and then you start to add meat to that bone as it goes through a couple of different cycles. When it comes down to it, what does the gated process really look like there to know that it's time to start building?
Because these are all version these specs are all version. So we would start with a bare bone spec, say 0.1, right? And then engineers would start building it, and over time, with every iteration, with every new addition that's going through these specs, we are versioning our engineering competence as well. So that's how we would treat iterations here. There isn't a set time for when we would start building a component, or when the spec is 80% complete and we need to start building these. There is always some starting point where a designer has the bare bones spec. We would start building it. We would start questioning about the choices we have here and raising concerns about whether this would work in a particular case or a particular device and whatnot. And then we will have accessibility specialists weigh in on the choices that a designer has made, and then we go from there.
Yeah, it's interesting, the idea of the creation of a spec as almost a product unto itself, where you have scaffolding that you create, and then you build some of the foundational bricks, and then you start to get the main structure all the way down to like the finishing treatments.
Yeah.
that's a pretty wide net to cast. How do you manage that collaboration? And this is a question for everybody. How do you manage the collaboration around this specification? Is that something that is core to the design system practice, or is that something that happens outside of the design system?
I can go first. At Meta, for the teams that I support, it is core for our design systems practice. Everything should have to come to the engineering in a bare bones spec form to start with, and then we take it from there on the engineering side and start building them out. This has been this makes designers and engineers find gaps in what we've been coming up with, and then fixing our component library from the start.
Totally. I think it is a core sort of skill in the design systems practice for design systems folks. But it is also a thing that, for instance, at DoorDash, we really wanted to help bring that to the broader product design practice in the org, and the sort of collaboration with engineering in the org, in the sense that we help train designers and engineers to think about, how do you build in such a way that you're thinking like systems designers, you have the right sort of language and templates that like we help provide and help standardize across the organization, so that you can actually have the same sort of like success and structure to what you're doing in your particular space. Because I think one of the things that's true about design systems, particularly at much larger orgs, is that there isn't just one design system necessarily. There's not just one material that people are using to build a product. There are all sorts of local systems that exist in a particular team or particular org, and so helping those orgs be self-sufficient and successful and thinking like design system designers is a part of the job of the design systems org to help facilitate. So I think it's something that we help train everyone to do everywhere.
Yeah, one of the things I like about that, Catherine, is when you say out loud, oh my gosh, you mean you want to start with documentation before you actually start writing code? People are like, oh, what a revolutionary concept. That in and of itself isn't the interesting part. And it's not even that like, oh, we want to actually write something down before we design. That's also not the interesting part. The interesting part is to get people thinking in systems and get them actually working together inside of those systems from the jump. Instead of it's this group, then it's this group, then it's this group. It's everybody's collaborating around a core centralized thing that then represents a systematic implementation at some future point.
Totally.
Melissa, jump in here. Where do you think about this as a practice?
I definitely think that's something within my space at GSK. It's a journey that we're on, where the specifications are really kind of owned and defined within the product space, and we would work with the various stakeholders outside of the design system practice, like legal and regulatory, as I mentioned. But as it kind of goes through the process, it's important to kind of have those check-ins with the stakeholders who are informing some of those requirements, even beyond okay, we got your input on the spec, we're good, but like looping back with them throughout the design and the engineering build, so that they can see how it's coming to fruition, and give feedback along the way if there's any course corrections that need to be made. So having that integration throughout the practice and the journey is important.
You're also in this interesting place. We work together, so offline, you've been talking a lot about this transition that folks are undergoing, where there's the idea of not everything has to be a comp, not everything has to go through a round trip in Figma before we actually go and build it. There's lots of things that are intrinsic to the design system that you should be able to create an excellent experience out of, even if you're not a professional designer or a professional in the engineering discipline. The idea of democratization feels really central to what you're going for here, and that's enabled by this early collaboration. So you want to talk about that transition? And I understand that like this is in progress, so definitely
Right.
judgment free here on where this is headed. But I'm curious to have you articulate the vision for like how this changes at GSK.
Yeah. So we are on the journey. We're a couple years into the design system journey, starting, very early with an MVP where our design system had basically the header and the footer of our websites and nothing else. And now we're moving to fully component-based design with components that we would like for the creative partners, which are largely external agencies, to leverage when they're going down the road of creating a new site for one of our brands. So the change from the creative phase happening, entirely outside of a design system with very few guardrails, to bringing them into a way of working that's very different, where we say, these are the components, these are our Lego blocks that we expect you to use to assemble and create the experience, is a huge change management effort. Um, it is something that takes a lot of time with education. Not all of our partners have used design systems. Some have, some haven't. So that's really a big part of what I think the design system team is, absolutely has to prioritize, is making sure that that initial experience for the partners or the users of our design system is a good one. But to the point of democratization of design, because we're a multi-brand company and the design system supporting many brands, not every brand is created equally. Some brands have, depending, they have varying degrees of budget, right? So smaller brands or smaller teams that still need a website but don't have the budget to, hire a top tier agency, they still need a website. So with the design system practice, we'll be able to offer them a solution without a huge spend from a creative or even engineering perspective. They just use all the Legos in our design system that we've made available. So that's another area that I think is going to help us be able to serve our patients that with websites and materials that they need, regardless of the budgets that the brand may have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful concept, because when we think about democratization, we oftentimes couch it with this idea that, like, oh, anybody should go and be able to create something. Well, so what? And the so what there is that any organization, regardless of budget, has somebody that owns that experience and owns that product. And that ability to go a lot further with very little resources is a really powerful way of leveraging that democratization to actually create something of value with very little effort. And that does innately mean that we have to change the process. This is actually one of the reasons why I got into design systems in the first place, is I used to build really big web platforms in web CMS land. And every single one of the sites that we would stand up on a web platform always had this round trip, either with an agency or with an internal team. It was like, we need to go make a bunch of designs, then we need to go implement that in the CMS. And then those are immediately going to be stale. And 6 months later, when somebody needs an update, you have to re-engage that agency or re-engage a platform team. And that was always really painful, especially for the parts of the organization that didn't have the budget to spend $30, $50, $100,000 every single cycle to make the changes that they needed to make. And that, to me, like, it exemplifies this sort of strained process that we've worked in for so long in how we create digital products. Catherine, what did this look like at DoorDash? Because I think this is an interesting direction for you, because you saw very early that this interdisciplinary collaboration was really important, and you yourself invested personally in making sure that you were a focal point of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that was interesting for us is that we started doing design systems as a practice very early, relatively, in the sort of life of the company. So we invested in it starting when we were about 5 designers and maybe 40, 50 engineers. And so being able to use the design system primarily at that time, because we had a very small design team as a means of leverage to help, all the many multiples of engineers that we had compared to designers still be able to work at quality, work with a level of sort of understanding and detail of what it is the design intent of like the brand and product should be. That was one of the reasons why we invested so early. And so being able to kind of use design systems as a means of like having other people that aren't sort of trained in the eye for quality, their eye for design, still be successful in producing great outcomes with that space is, I think, part of the magic of design systems. And I think especially like pontificating into the future, thinking about how AI can help make design systems continue to be more accessible for someone that doesn't understand, necessarily the design or engineering side of building to still be successful, leveraging design systems, creating design systems to build great products with AI as an assistant and a co-pilot. I think there's an interesting space that, we're still very early days in figuring out.
Yeah, and I feel like I keep saying things that represent kind of the funny after effect of your comments, but like it's more than sane defaults, right? Like we talk a lot about the idea of how to create sane defaults inside of design systems. If those sane defaults aren't adaptive or aren't useful for people that don't understand why those defaults exist in the first place, it's not actually going to create better product. And I think one of the things that you mentioned that is really important is a lack of understanding, right? If you lack context understanding, how do you still have the ability to make the system work for you? And Sriram, this is interesting for you as well, because you have folks that implement patterns from your design system across a massively diverse set of platforms that have a lot of different contexts. And those different contexts are broadly unaware of a lot of other different contexts. For example, like Instagram on iOS probably doesn't really think a lot about like the WhatsApp experience. And so when you think about that, like how do you make the stuff that you're building contextually relevant across all those different platforms that exist inside of your ecosystem?
This is the big shift that we've been having at Meta. We are starting to think about interoperable design systems. So to give some previous context, each of the big brands have their own design systems. So there is an Instagram design system, there is a design system for Messenger, one for Facebook and whatnot. In our iterations for each of these design systems, we had initially taken a path for creating a new component library, creating a new set of vocabulary for these design iterations, and trying to have this particular design system be adopted in currently shipping production code, right? And when we realized that the adoption is super expensive, we started splitting the design decisions from the component mechanics. So the design decisions are basically encoded as design tokens, and then you can iterate on these design tokens individually. Then the component mechanics are just going to say a button should have a click event, or a list cell should be displayed in a particular way, right? When you split those things, what we realized was the component mechanics are almost the same across all these design systems. The design decisions are the ones that change based on the brand, based on the design intent, based on the type of user a particular product will have. So that's the big shift that is happening, where we want to have a shared design system agnostic library, and then plug in any kind of theme that we want to use the same components across all these platforms. Again, going back to spec, this is where the specs will help us, because now we are not looking at 200 different variants a button can have. We are looking at these specs and comparing what are the differences, what are the similarities between these two things, what design intents are the same, what design intents are different, do we have to have this difference in terms of design intents, can we agree on having the same design intent, and whatnot.
It's really interesting. Taking sort of the opposite side of this approach, we talked about like how folks that are ignorant of context oftentimes need that context provided for them. I think one of the things that really changes and shapes people's careers is when they realize that ignorance of another context and they start to move in that direction and learn there. This gets into like, what do we call ourselves, right? In this new systems-based approach where design and engineering are converging around these ideas of like, what are the governing systems that represent how we build product? What is that called? Is that still design systems? Are we all still designers and engineers? Are we something else? Yeah, I was just at an event last week where one of the interesting pieces of the conversation was like, what do I tell my team what job titles to search for? And there's all of these sort of changes afoot inside of the way we create our digital products. And design systems are absolutely a major piece of that. And I think we're actually at a point now where people are recognizing that design systems are more than component libraries, more than design tokens. They're these sort of ways of working. And I'm curious, like, how do you view this evolution? And again, like Catherine, I love your pontification. Like, so feel free to soapbox a little here. Where do you see the future of this headed? Let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately at the end of the day, like the best frame for like maybe this isn't the best job title, but it's the best frame of mind that I think people building products should think about are ultimately we're all builders. We're the folks that are defining what it is that the product is and what we're putting out into the world. And I think being able to kind of abstract yourself from the particular skill set or particular sort of technology that you're using is the right sort of way of thinking about yourself more broadly. And in terms of the job title, I think that it's one of those things where, my 10-year sort of prediction from, let's say, 5 years ago was always that design and engineering is going to, what we think of design and UI or front end engineering today, those things start to converge much more closely into similar sort of spaces. And I think the idea that you're a design technologist or a design engineer or a design systems engineer, what have you, all those things are valid like ways of naming yourself. But I think ultimately you're going to be thinking yourself as someone that is a builder and that like does a little bit of design, a little bit of engineering, maybe gets some help through AI. And that's what the sort of roles that we're stepping into are going to be looking like in 3, 4, or 5 years.
Awesome. Love that take. What about you, Melissa?
It's a great question. We we don't have a formal organization structure around design system currently, so I've been thinking a lot about that as we're on our transformation journey. And I've been looking at LinkedIn, trying to find job descriptions like, what do people call this thing? So I'm one of those people is like, what the heck do we call this? Um, at a minimum, design system in itself is the product. So I'm trying to, position it as a product team. How designers and engineers roll into that, that is something that I agree, Catherine, that ultimately there needs to be almost a merging there. They're so close, but at the end of the day, they do have different jobs. So how to carve that out is something we have to figure out. And I think there's another role that is really important in the larger scale implementations, like we have at GSK, and that's the role that is, again, I don't know what to call it, so I'm just going to describe it. It's the one working with the users, the external agency partners that are trying to use the design system. When you have the scale of dozens of agencies and multiple teams within those agencies, you'll have so many, like hundreds of users potentially. So there is a need for a role that is really the enabler. They're part of the design system team. They're an expert on the components, but they're the ones helping, uh, you know, helping our users effectively use the system. They're not the designer, they're not the builder, but they're the enabler, and that is a role that I would love to come up with a name. And yeah,
When you think about it, let us know.
absolutely.
All right, bring us home, Mr.
Um, I don't have a role or title in my mind. The big shift I'm seeing is designers learning about engineering principles and the way engineers are thinking. For example, Figma is thinking in terms of props, and designers are like, what are these props? What is auto layout? How do I structure a component in a way that represents engineering, right? So they are stretching themselves into an engineering way of thinking from the way they've been used to. Similarly, engineers are also questioning design choices, understanding design principles. And I have people on my team asking like, why is cap height to baseline important? And everyone is going like, what? Cap height to baseline? What exactly is this, right? So there is this cross-pollination of ideas. There is this well-roundedness that is happening, which wasn't there 5, 10 years ago, where there used to be designers coming up with pixels, and there used to be engineers building them as front-end engineers. So the industry is changing. Do we have a name? I don't know. We'll arrive at one in the next 5 years.
Yeah, naming things is hard.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you all so much for participating in this. I'm so grateful. You all are what make this content wonderful. So just want to say I really appreciate you all. With that, I wanted to leave ample time for us to jump into some questions. If you're able to see this, you can also, of course, reach out to us at Knapsack, hello@knapsack.cloud, if you want to chat, be on a webinar, talk to us about this sort of stuff. But with that, I think we have a few questions that are open right now that we can dive into. First, hey Nathan. Of the following problems, which is the most important notable trigger? Writing it down in a spec. One, designers also produce outputs like docs and Figma components. Two, there are multiple code library outputs, React, iOS, Android. Or three, DSs are made to change and specs are a place to track and communicate those changes. Gosh, when I look at that, all three, I think that there is I think that there is a separation between what is a spec and what is a piece of documentation in a design system. That is an important distinction. There is an idea of like, this is usage, this is do's and don'ts, this is example code, this is example implementations of a component or a design that does differ from what the thing is itself. Likewise, I think that there are multiple outputs from that specification that need to be considered as a part of inputs. I think that if you have an output from the system that wasn't involved in the input, there's the potential for there to be a gap there. And the involvement of those people upfront makes a lot of sense. And then I think that like the ability to control that change via workflow and track and communicate that change, that absolutely feels like the core of why we do these things. We were talking a little bit earlier about the need for iteration and specification. And if we're not able to control how the specification changes, we might as well not have one at all. But beyond my take, who else has got some things to jump in on that?
I definitely agree. I think the way that I think of systems is it is a structured way of sort of providing the scaffolding for how you should like think about specifying and making clear what it is the intent of your whatever your building is, with like the sort of same language between both sides. And so any of these things I think are like the are relevant ways of sort of triggering, okay, like maybe we should put it down in spec. If there's sort of chaoticness, or if there's a need to provide more structure, the system and the spec is a way to help sort of move your process and practice into that direction. And those are all sort of events that could necessitate that need for more structure.
Sriram, I know you got opinions on this. You have to.
Yeah, I'm checking the question again.
Maybe the easiest
I think that
maybe the easiest way to ask this is in the output of the spec, what is side by side with that specification that isn't the spec in your design system?
Sorry, I'm not following the question. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, so the question is, what is the key trigger for writing it down in a spec? Is it the outputs, like the multiple outputs? Is it the ability to track and manage change, or is it things like docs and additional Figma components that really represent the need for this stuff? Like, what is the governing trigger for that?
The governing trigger is for us to record our decisions in a centralized place, so that if you want to iterate on them, if you want to expand that to future design systems, this becomes the source. This becomes a repository of these decisions, and that's what triggered us to invest in specs over these years, because we are all humans. We make mistakes everywhere, and you could think a Figma component to have a particular corner radius, but use a different value. So when you record those decisions in a piece of doc, it's easy to litigate those and be like, this is not the right value I'm seeing in a Figma, and are we supposed to be using this? And this becomes a reference point for someone taking and building it in future versions of these.
Melissa, do you have anything to add?
No, I think I'm good on that one.
Next thing from Jackie is actually more of a comment. Hi, Jackie. Jackie was saying Melissa perhaps use design system ops, which I think is a good title. We've actually kind of kicked around like product systems and a few other things like that because the term design is so weighted. Thinking about that for a second, when we talk about design systems, and you talk about that to the unanointed, which are often the folks that have budget control over these sorts of things, there is an implication that there is a design leadership aspect to it. What do you all think about the term design systems or something like design system ops?
It is one that I did consider, and still certainly up for consideration for that role of enablement and making sure that things are operating smoothly, no pun intended. I think where there's there is an education opportunity around um, the different kind of operational roles that already exist in an organization, such as website operations. That is not the same thing as design system operations, but there's a website ops role that does things like, making sure the security testing is done and like all the stuff that we do with website ops, but explaining the distinction between design system ops and website ops is is part of the education process to leadership to help them understand why these roles are different and why they're both needed.
Catherine, this is you and I have jammed on this before,
Yeah.
so I love to
I
hear.
have a lot of thoughts on this. So for my org at DoorDash, when we were thinking about it, we chose the name sort of design infrastructure because it was it was a team that was focused on building the tools and the operational infrastructure for designers and engineers to build our products. I think if I were doing it today, I would probably think about it more broadly, where it was like product development infrastructure. It's a little bit of a handful, but it actually, I think, is more representative of what it is that we're doing, because it's not just design infrastructure. It's the things that we're making for not just designers or engineers, but also a lot of things that we were building for product and product operations and all these other sort of spaces that are involved in the actual process of building what it is that we're making. And so I think, that's probably the most accurate, but I think there are ways of thinking about it that are more contextual to your particular company or space.
How do you think about this at Meta, Sriram?
The the design system ops, I've come across that name, but more in the context of program managers and project managers. They are setting up the structure for design systems to operate well. That's the only thought I have about that particular naming.
Next one's from an anonymous attendee. This is really interesting. It's about governance. So when you think about the idea of receiving multiple basic specifications for a component without a lot of deep or thoughtful evaluation, does it create proliferation of components? Do you end up with lots of different specs for a button or lots of different specs for a card? And what does the governance look like to decide which spec wins or is the one that ends up being adopted? And how does that structure relate to the core design system team?
I can take that. So there isn't a case of multiple bar specifications for a specific component. Usually these are owned by a centralized design team here at Meta. So the centralized design system designers come up with these specs and work with engineers. And there is a weekly forum for designers and engineers to come together and decide if this is built the right way. Does it address all different possibilities that we want within our app? What would happen though is there would be one product team that would come in and say, I want this expansion. I want this particular variant. I want to change this in a particular way. And there are specific channels to introduce this feedback, and this still goes through this central governance group, which is the core design system designers and engineers. So they are the gatekeepers for making sure the system doesn't expand in ways that we don't want the brand or the design system to expand.
I think one way that I put the work of doing design systems is that it's a way of providing structure to chaos. And so one of the things that I think is really important in this question is that I think there is some amount of rogue specification or something new and something custom that is important for individual product teams to be able to have like the space to experiment and learn, and then ultimately bring that knowledge back to like the broader organization through the design system. And so I think one of the things that is an art of being a design systems manager is knowing how to provide the right process, the right governance, so that you can still have some of that experimentation and proliferation and learning, whilst being able to figure out, okay, how do you then make that useful for everyone, and then bring that to the broader sort of community. And so I think there's a lot of nuances to how you do that specifically, but I think having that understanding and frame of like, oh, this is ultimately what we're doing, we're not trying to squash all these things from ever happening, I think is an important like point to think about.
When we're advising customers, oftentimes the tactic we take here is implementation dependent. Everybody's a little different, but when it comes to the governance side of it, we typically say that at least for fairly new design systems, about 70% of the work you do inside of your design system should be really focused on how you actually serve the immediate needs of your product teams. And then about 30% should be exploration. And that exploration is all about growing a wider net to serve more use cases inside of your different products. No organization I know has sanely tried to approach 100% adoption of their design system. And so you always have this sort of push-pull of how do I serve the use cases that are most present and most important in my design system, while also expanding the capabilities of the design system to encompass more additional use cases. And that is something that is innately a human process. I think that there are tools that help with that. But the idea of how do you create that roadmap, that governance, that idea of where that new exploration heads, like where do your experiments pipelines show up? That's something that is absolutely a conversation between design, engineering, and product leaders, and probably some other stakeholders inside of your organization to really figure out. Nathan had one more that I really like. How do your teams deal with the spec versus built well as a Figma asset, chicken versus egg problem? Each one of these things informs the other, and automated spec tools work much better with well-built Figma components that also then depend on specs. And so there's this cyclical nature to this of like, hey, you've done this great job of expressing your intent in a design tool. And from that intent, we can create a really awesome spec. But then to actually create that really awesome Figma intent, you have to have that spec to base it on. This is, I think, is the exact cycle that we were talking about, the disruption of earlier on, where there's this idea that somehow there is this unidirectional flow of these things. And in that river of design to code, we oftentimes create ourselves these little back eddies where you can go do these cycles. I think that what we're talking about by saying that like the spec is the governing document is the spec becomes the starting place. The spec is where design intent is first expressed. And that shifts things from a thinking perspective, where it's not like code is implementing Figma. It's that everybody's implementing the spec. And the spec is what gets implemented in Figma or Sketch or whatever your design tool is. It also gets implemented in code. It gets implemented in living room devices, native devices, web devices. And all of it stems from that central point. There is no like first governing tool or first governing system. The first governing thing is the doc itself. Now that means that like that has to be really robust, but I think that that's how you break out of the chicken and egg issue. Do you all agree with that?
Almost. I'll take a little bit different take. You will have to start somewhere because we are dealing with pixels. We are dealing with visual stuff. So it's not it's not to say that we cannot start with Figma, but Figma won't be complete until you document those decisions in specs. And then from that point forward, spec will be the centralized source of truth. And we will have to expand across Figma, other prototyping design tools, and then different kinds of UI libraries. So just to convey the idea that I'm thinking of a component that looks like this, you need some design tool of choice. But after that point, it is all documented in a spec document.
Does it matter what the origin point is? What if some enterprising engineer creates a really cool table component in React? Could that be the start of a spec as well?
For sure. Yeah.
Totally. I think it's one of those things where it's highly dependent on the maturity of your product sort of development team, your design systems org, kind of where you are in that life cycle to be able to say like, hey, like everything has to start on the spec side. I think there are very few companies, at much larger sizes that are working with that rigor. And so I think like, being able to say, hey, the origin point can be some design that some other product team built, or like some component that some engineer had. I think being able to be flexible from where these things start, but ultimately go through that process that you talked about with the spec, that has to happen. But where it kind of starts doesn't really matter.
Yeah, Melissa, where do you think about origin points for this? Because I think you of all of the panelists have probably the most diverse set of origins, because a lot of yours come from mandates and regulatory stuff.
Yeah, I think it's really the product team that is triaging all the different inputs and requests and looking across to see what makes sense across the organization from an enterprise perspective. Can this new thing be reusable, applicable to other brands? But we do want to, our goal is to have at least 80% adoption. That's our goal. It's not where we are now, but have that space for 20% of the innovation or those edge cases that really don't have enterprise applicability, but we still, there's still value that it needs to be delivered for the users in that particular case. So it all starts at whoever's submitting the request or the input. Definitely comes into the product team first to do that kind of business triage, business prioritization.
Awesome. Well, hey, that's all the time we have today. I know there are a couple of other questions we didn't get to. We'll do our best to answer them offline. Again, a huge amount of gratitude to you all as panelists. Thank you so much for being here. If this event was great for you, you're interested in participating in a future event, checking out another webinar, you can head over to knapsack.cloud and check out our events page. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you all have a great day.
Hi, everyone.